The Galactic Reach Empire had never lost a war, not once. Not in 412 years of expansion across the stars. They had swallowed the Velthari Collective in 11 days. They had broken the Drenathi hive mind so completely that the Drenathi stopped using the word war in their language and replaced it with a phrase that loosely translated to the thing that happened before the Empire arrived. They had absorbed 63 civilizations, 17 of which had been considered military powers by galactic standards. And not one of them had made the Empire bleed in any way that mattered. The Empire did not fight wars, it ended them. This was the thought sitting comfortably in the mind of High Commander Valdros, as his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of an unremarkable yellow star system on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. He stood the observation deck of the dreadnought Absolute Dominion and looked at the pale blue dot hanging in the black, and he felt nothing in particular. Just the quiet, familiar satisfaction of a man who had done this many times before and expected to do it many times again. Behind him, 1,200 warships spread across space like a metal storm. The scout reports had been strange. That was the only word for them. Strange, not alarming, strange. The species on the third planet of this system had achieved faster-than-light travel only 40 years ago, which by galactic standards made them infants. Their military technology was 2 centuries behind the Empire's. Their population, while large, was concentrated on a single homeworld and a handful of colonies. On paper they were nothing. On paper they were a Tuesday. But the scout reports had been strange. Sub-Commander Prethvos stepped up beside Valdros, holding a data tablet. Prethvos was young, careful, and had a habit of clearing his throat before delivering bad news. He cleared his throat now. The latest scout relay, sir. Valdros took the tablet without looking away from the blue planet. Summarize. The species calls itself human. They've been aware of our scouts for approximately 3 weeks. Standard protocol would suggest they'd be in full military mobilization by now. Weapon production, defensive fortification, civilian evacuation from border colonies. Prethvos paused. They are not doing any of those things. Valdros looked at him. None? Their military has been placed on what they call elevated alert. Their political leaders have been meeting regularly, but the civilian population appears to be. Prethvos looked at his tablet like it had personally offended him. Going about their normal lives, sir. Valdros turned back to the window. They don't know we're here. They know, sir. We confirmed they detected our scouts. Their news broadcasts have been discussing it openly. They've been calling it a significant moment in human history. There have been public debates, opinion columns. Something called a podcast. He paused again. One of their major information networks ran a poll asking civilians whether they thought the Empire was a threat. 41% said yes. 37% said they weren't sure. 22% said they were more worried about something called a midterm election. The observation deck was quiet for a moment. What, said Valdros, is a midterm election? A political process, sir, internal to their governance structure. As far as our translators can determine, it is a method by which they select representatives. It occurs on a fixed schedule regardless of external circumstances. They are scheduling a political event while a 1,200-ship fleet moves toward their system. Yes, sir. The election is in 6 weeks. There appears to be significant public interest. Valdros set the tablet down on the railing in front of him. He pressed 2 of his 6 fingers against the bridge of his nose and breathed slowly. He had faced panicking civilizations. He had faced brave ones. He had faced species that threw every warship they owned at him in suicidal charges, and species that immediately surrendered without a shot, and species that tried to negotiate with gifts and tribute. In 400 years of Imperial history, the playbook covered every response. It did not cover this. Send the standard broadcast, he said, demand of surrender. Give them the usual terms. The broadcast went out 20 minutes later, translated by the Empire's best linguistic AI into the primary human language. It was a message the Empire had sent 63 times before. It outlined the terms of absorption into the galactic reach. It detailed the consequences of resistance. It was, as Imperial broadcasts went, efficient and not unnecessarily cruel. The Empire preferred willing subjects to broken ones, as a general rule, because willing subjects paid taxes and broken ones required expensive occupation forces. They waited. The response came 40 minutes later. The communications officer, a gray-skinned Velthari who had served on Imperial ships since before the absorption of his own people, turned from his console with an expression that could only be described as confused. Sir, he said, we have a response. Put it through. The voice that came through the speakers was human, male by the tonal qualities the translator flagged. It was a relaxed voice. Valdros had heard thousands of alien voices respond to Imperial surrender demands. He had heard fear, defiance, formality, desperation. He had heard one species respond entirely in what turned out to be religious hymns. He had never heard this. A voice that sounded like it was talking to someone it knew, in the middle of something else it was doing. "Yeah, hi," the voice said. "We got your message. Thanks for the translation. That AI is pretty good, by the way. Few quirks in the phrasing, but broadly solid work. So, the council is meeting right now to discuss your terms, and we'll definitely get back to you on all of that. But here's the thing. It's currently 12:47 here in Geneva, which is where our main government is based, and we kind of have a situation going on. Could you maybe, and I want to stress this is not us being dismissive, we're taking the whole thing seriously, but could you possibly wait until about, say, 2 o'clock? Maybe 2:30 to be safe. We're in the middle of a working lunch that's actually been scheduled for 3 weeks, and some pretty important people took long flights to be here, and it would be genuinely awkward to just, yeah." A pause. "We'll call you back, promise, thanks." The transmission ended. Nobody on the bridge of the Absolute Dominion spoke for a long moment. Prethvos was the one who broke the silence. "Sir," he said carefully, "did they just ask us to wait until after lunch?" Vaildros did not answer immediately. He was running through a mental checklist of every response protocol he had ever been trained in. Denial, negotiation, aggression, religious submission, military posturing, begging. Nowhere in any protocol, in any training simulation, in any historical record of Imperial First Contact, had there been a category for this. For what could only be described as mild administrative inconvenience expressed toward a conquering fleet. He looked at his fleet admiral. Is it possible this is some form of psychological tactic? Fleet Admiral Shendrova, who had destroyed more enemy ships than anyone currently alive in Imperial service and who was not a woman given to uncertainty, looked genuinely unsure. "It doesn't match any known intimidation doctrine, sir. No known species uses deliberate casualness as a destabilization tactic at first contact. The resource investment required to maintain such a bluff against a fleet of this size would be irrational," Vaildros said. "Yes, sir. They are being irrational. That appears to be the case, sir." Vaildros picked the data tablet back up and read through the scout reports again. He read them more carefully this time. He stopped on a section he had skimmed before, a cultural and historical summary compiled by the Empire's Xenological Analysis Division, which did excellent work and which most fleet commanders ignored because it was usually unnecessary. The Velthari didn't need to be understood. The Drenathi didn't need to be understood. You studied the enemy's weapons, their fleet formations, their defensive grids. You didn't need to understand their lunch schedules. He read through the xenological summary now. It took him a while. It was a long document. The Empire's analysts had clearly found humans interesting enough to write at length about, which was itself unusual. The section on human military history alone was longer than some of the full civilization reports the Empire had on file. Humans had been conducting organized warfare against other humans for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years of war fought without access to alien technology, without faster-than-light weapons, without the tools that made modern galactic conflict efficient and decisive. 10,000 years of war fought with metal and fire, and in earlier periods with shaped stone. They had fought each other with shaped stone, deliberately, for centuries. There was a section on something called the Second World War, which the analysts had flagged as a notable example of human military capacity. The conflict had involved a significant portion of the entire human species. It had lasted 6 years. The casualty figures were listed in tens of millions. Vaildros read them twice because he thought the translation must be wrong. It was not wrong. He found a smaller section buried near the end, titled Notable Behavioral Observations. One entry read, "Humans appear to have a significantly higher threshold for physical and psychological stress than comparative galactic species. Preliminary modeling suggests this may be a result of evolutionary pressures on their homeworld, which hosts an unusually high density of apex predators relative to the cognitive development level of its dominant species. In simple terms, humans evolved in an environment that was actively trying to kill them, and they won." The next entry read, "Human soldiers in historical conflicts have been documented eating meals, telling jokes, and engaging in recreational activities in close proximity to active combat zones. Cultural analysis suggests this is not a sign of low-threat assessment, but rather a coping mechanism for high-stress environments, so normalized that it no longer registers as unusual behavior." The entry after that, "Humans do not have a biological off-switch for aggression once it is triggered. Most galactic species have natural neurochemical regulation that dampens aggressive response after a threat is neutralized. Humans appear to continue producing threat response hormones for extended periods. Their soldiers describe the sensation as getting in the zone. They appear to actively seek this state." Vaildros set the tablet down again. He looked at the pale blue planet. He thought about the voice on the transmission, the easy, unbothered voice. The voice that said, "We'll call you back," promised to a fleet of 1,200 warships. He thought about Shaped Stone. "Sir," said Prethvos, "what are your orders?" Valdros was quiet for another moment. Outside, the stars hung in their usual places. The fleet waited. 1,200 ships, the finest warships the Empire had ever built. Sitting in the dark at the edge of a system where a species that had invented war before it invented writing was currently having a working lunch. "We wait until 2:30, he said. Prethvos blinked. "Sir, they asked us to wait until 2:30. "We wait until 2:30. He straightened his uniform. "And I want every xenological report on this species on my desk in 2 hours. Everything. History, biology, military doctrine, psychology, everything." He turned away from the window. "And someone find out what a podcast is." The fleet held position. 2 hours later, Valdros had read every page the analysts had prepared. Some of it he read twice. The parts about the thing humans called spite, he read 3 times, because the translators kept flagging it as a concept that didn't have a clean equivalent in Imperial language. The closest approximation the AI could manage was the willingness to accept personal harm in order to cause harm to another party, even when the logical outcome is negative for both participants. The analysts had noted, almost as an aside, that this trait appeared to be widespread in the human population and was considered by humans themselves to be, in certain contexts, admirable. The transmission came in at exactly 2:17. The same voice, still relaxed. "Okay, we're back. Sorry about that." One of the representatives had a dietary restriction nobody had flagged, so it took a bit to sort. "Good meeting, though, genuinely productive. So, the council has reviewed your terms and we have a few thoughts. Primarily that the terms are not great, and we'd like to counter-propose. If someone on your end wants to set up a call, we can walk through it. We're flexible on timing, though if you could avoid Tuesday afternoons, that would be helpful. We've got standing committee sessions." A pause. "Also, and I want to be completely upfront with you here, the Security Council did authorize a military response if you decide to proceed with any hostile action. So that's on the table. But we genuinely prefer to talk first, let us know." Another pause. The voice dropped half a register, just briefly. "And please don't do anything to the colonies." The people there didn't do anything. The transmission ended. Valdros sat with it for a long time. The standing committee sessions. The dietary restriction. The mild, almost apologetic warning about military response. The way you'd tell a neighbor you had a dog before they knocked on the gate. He thought about the xenological report. He thought about 10,000 years of war with Shaped Stone. He thought about spite. "All ships," he said. "Combat formation, move us in." He told himself it was the right call. He had 1,200 ships. He had done this 63 times. This was a Tuesday. He almost believed it. The first engagement happened at a human colony called Proxima Station. It was not much to look at. A prefabricated outpost sitting in the orbit of a red dwarf star, 4 light-years from Earth, built in sections over 12 years by humans who had been in space for less than 4 decades. The station housed about 9,000 people, miners, researchers, engineers, families. Its military garrison consisted of 200 soldiers, a small orbital defense grid, and 4 warships that the Imperial fleet's tactical AI classified as light frigates, which in Imperial terms meant ships we could destroy by accident while parking. Subcommander Prethvos had suggested skipping Proxima Station entirely and going straight for Earth. Taking the homeworld first was standard Imperial doctrine. Cut the head off the beast. The colonies would surrender once the homeworld fell. Valdros had agreed in principle but overruled him, not for tactical reasons, for psychological ones. He wanted to see what humans did when they were outmatched. He wanted a data point before he committed the full fleet to the main engagement. Something in those xenological reports had been sitting in the back of his mind like a splinter, too small to see clearly, too irritating to ignore. So he sent 40 ships to Proxima Station, 40-4, 10-1 odds, not counting the station's fixed defenses, which his tactical AI estimated would be neutralized in the first exchange. He watched the engagement from the Absolute Dominion's battle bridge, 40 light minutes away, via relay. The first thing that happened was that the Imperial fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately sent the standard demand for immediate surrender. This was protocol. Give them the choice. Let them stand down. It saved ammunition and reduced the administrative burden of occupation. The human garrison commander's response came back in 11 seconds. Not a surrender. A voice, different from the one in Geneva, this one female, and the tone had something in it that the linguistic AI flagged as elevated aggression markers, possible humor. Context unclear, she said. 40 ships. Huh, you guys must be really worried about us. A sound followed that the AI identified as laughter. Stand by. Prethvos, watching on the relay beside Veildros, said quietly, "Stand by for what?" Nobody on the bridge answered him. They watched. The 4 human frigates moved. They did not move in formation. They did not move in any configuration that the Imperial tactical AI recognized or could immediately categorize. They moved in something that looked, at first, like pure chaos, each ship diverging in a completely different direction, spreading away from the station at maximum speed, going in 4 completely different vectors like startled animals. The tactical AI ran projections and concluded they were attempting to flee the engagement zone, which was the only logical interpretation. The Imperial fleet split to intercept, which was textbook. You didn't let enemy ships escape to report back and regroup. Standard procedure. 2 ships to each human frigate, neutralize them cleanly, then come back and deal with the station. They were 2 minutes into the pursuit when the first Imperial ship went dark. Then the second. Then 3 more almost simultaneously. The tactical feed erupted with damage reports, and Veildros leaned forward in his command seat and tried to understand what he was seeing, because what he was seeing did not make sense. The human frigates hadn't turned to fight. They were still running. The destroyed Imperial ships had been hit by. He checked again, the station's defense grid, which had opened fire across the pursuit vectors at angles that should have been impossible without hitting the fleeing human ships. The humans had run in exactly the directions that would pull the Imperial ships into the station's firing lines. Not chaos, not panic. The AI had called it an escape pattern because it looked like one. It was not an escape pattern. It was a kill box. They planned that, Prethvos said. He sounded genuinely surprised, and he was not a man who was surprised easily. The remaining Imperial ships recalibrated and pushed forward, and the 4 human frigates looped back around, and now they were fighting. Coming in from 4 separate angles, refusing to consolidate, refusing to give the Imperial formation a clean broadside target, forcing the Imperial ships to track in 4 directions at once. The tactics were not sophisticated by Imperial standards. The ships were not powerful by Imperial standards, but they moved like the pilots inside them had no particular concern for the survival of the ships themselves, which was disorienting in a way that was difficult to articulate tactically. Imperial doctrine was built around the premise that an enemy's primary goal was to survive the engagement. You use that. You push them into kill angles and let self-preservation do the rest of the work. The human ships moved like the pilots had put self-preservation in a drawer somewhere and forgotten which drawer. One of the frigates took a direct hit from an Imperial heavy cannon. The shot should have cracked the hull and ended the engagement for that ship. Instead, the ship spun on its axis, used the momentum of the blast to complete a turn that would have taken it 3 times as long under its own engine power, and came back around on a course that put it directly behind one of the larger Imperial destroyers. The tactical AI spent a full second trying to determine if what it had just seen was intentional. It was intentional. The battle lasted 44 minutes. By the end of it, the Empire controlled Proxima Station. The 4 human frigates were destroyed, 3 of them, anyway. The 4th had taken enough damage that it wasn't flying anywhere, but it was still broadcasting. The garrison the station and had fought until the Imperial ground troops physically reached them. And even then it had taken longer than it should have. The Imperial fleet had lost 9 ships, against 4 human frigates and a fixed defense grid. The projections had said 2 ships lost maximum against this level of opposition. The projections had been built on 400 years of historical engagement data. They had never been this wrong. Prethvos stood next to Veildros and they both looked at the numbers for a long moment. 9, Prethvos said. He said it the way you might say a word in a foreign language that you'd just been told meant something terrible. 9, Veildros confirmed. The relay was still open. The surviving human frigate was still transmitting, and because the Imperial translation systems were running continuously, they could hear what was being broadcast. They were expecting a distress call, military status reports, requests for evacuation. What they heard for the first 30 seconds was music, loud music, some kind of percussion-heavy composition with what sounded like multiple human voices singing in unison. And the translation AI could only capture fragments of the lyrics, but what it got included the phrases, "We're not gonna take it," and "We've got the right to choose," and "We ain't gonna live forever, honey." Then a human voice, male, came on top of the music. He was breathing harder than normal, but his voice was level. "Station, this is Lieutenant Commander Rask on the Persephone. We're not going anywhere under our own power, but guns are still up, just so they know." A pause. "Also, can someone tell Medic Chen she was right about the approach angle on that last run? I'm going to be annoyed about that forever. She can have the win." Then, impossibly, the sound of laughter. Multiple people in the background. Then a different voice, higher pitched, clearly younger, said, "Hey sir, are we in trouble?" And Rask's voice came back, easy and warm. Nah, we're fine. They're the ones who should be worried. Veildros sat with that for a long time. His tactical staff prepared the after-action report while he sat. They were careful, thorough people, and their report was detailed. It noted the killbox maneuver, the deliberate use of ballistic momentum in combat, the unconventional split-vector engagement pattern. It classified the garrison commander's tactics as improvised but effective. It noted the anomalous resilience of the human crew under sustained fire. In the section on psychological assessment, one of his junior analysts, a young officer named Drei Voss, who was probably going to go far, had written a small note. Human crew members on the surviving vessel were observed singing and exchanging humor during and after active combat. This does not match any known coping behavior model. Recommend escalating xenological study. Recommend escalating xenological study. Veildros approved the report and forwarded it up the chain. Then he opened the xenological files again. He went back to the section on human emotional response under stress. He read the part about the hormone called adrenaline, a threat response chemical the human body produced, which enhanced strength, speed, and pain tolerance. Most species had something equivalent. Most species had neurological systems that suppressed this response after the threat was removed, because sustaining it was biologically expensive and damaging. Humans did not reliably suppress it. Humans, according to the xenological report, frequently described the adrenaline state as feeling alive. Some humans deliberately pursued situations that triggered it recreationally. Some humans did this for fun. He read that sentence 3 times. The second engagement happened 4 days later, at a colony called the Kepler Ring. Larger installation. Military presence included a full regiment, about 3,000 soldiers, and 12 warships. He sent 80 ships this time. 2-to-1 odds felt like overkill. That was the point. He wanted clean numbers. The battle lasted 9 hours. He lost 17 ships. The garrison at the Kepler Ring surrendered eventually. Not because they had run out of will, but because they had run out of ammunition. The Imperial troops who processed the surrender reported that the human soldiers had been eating ration packs during the final phase of the battle, heating them on the exhaust vents of their own damaged weapons, because the kitchen facilities had been destroyed. 3 hours earlier, and they were hungry. They were hungry. They ate. They kept fighting. One of the soldiers, apparently, had complained loudly and at length about the quality of the ration packs, while simultaneously holding a defensive position against an Imperial advance. Her fellow soldiers had told her to shut up about it. She had continued complaining. She had also continued fighting. The Imperial officer who had processed the surrender included this detail in his report because he genuinely did not know what to do with it and felt that someone above his rank should make the determination. Veildros read the report on the bridge of the Absolute Dominion and stared at it for a very long time. 17 ships. From 12 in a ground garrison with supply limitations. Prethvos was standing at his shoulder. "Sir," he said, in the careful voice he used when he was about to say something he thought might not land well. "The projections for the Earth engagement, based on these results." "I've seen the updated projections," Veildros said. "They suggest we may need to reassign additional fleet resources before." "I've seen them, Preeth." "Sir, the engagement at the Kepler Ring." The surrender processing officer noted that the human soldiers, in the final phase, when they knew they were out of ammunition and the position was lost, one of them asked an Imperial trooper if we had any snacks. Veildros turned slowly and looked at his sub-commander. "She asked." Prethvos continued, clearly wishing he did not have to continue, "whether we had anything with peanut butter." Apparently she had been thinking about it for 2 hours. The bridge was very quiet. "She wasn't afraid," Veildros said. "Not a question. The processing report says she seemed, and I am quoting directly from the officer's assessment, extremely normal about everything." Prethvos put the tablet down on the console. "Sir, what are we dealing with?" Veildros looked back out at the stars. At the direction of the blue planet, still 4 light years away, still having its midterm election, still scheduling its committee meetings. "I don't know," he said. It was the first time in his career he had said those words in reference to an enemy. He did not find it comfortable. He ordered the fleet to hold at the Kepler Ring while he waited for the full Xenological Division's expanded report, which he had requested at triple priority 6 days ago, and which, he was told, was nearly ready. He had a feeling he was not going to like what it said. He was right. The xenological report was 417 pages long. This was unusual. Standard xenological assessments for newly contacted species ran between 20 and 40 pages. The Velthari had gotten 32. The Dranathi, despite being a hive mind with a civilization spanning 6 systems, had warranted 58. The team responsible for this one had apparently been unable to stop writing, and Veildros, sitting in his private quarters aboard the Absolute Dominion, with a cup of cold nutrient broth he had forgotten to drink, understood why after the first 100 pages. He had been a commander for 38 years. He had studied warfare for 20 years before that. He had read histories of every species the Empire had ever absorbed, and a dozen more it hadn't. He had a professional relationship with violence. He understood it. He was not a man who was easily disturbed. He was disturbed. The report opened with a biological summary. The analysts had clearly felt it was important context, and they were right. Humans, they explained, had evolved on a planet they called Earth, which by the biological standards of habitable planets in this arm of the galaxy was something of an anomaly. Most habitable planets had predator populations balanced against their dominant intelligent species in a way that allowed cognitive development to proceed without constant violent threat. Earth had not gotten that memo. Earth's surface, at the point when humans were developing basic cognition, was home to an extraordinary range of creatures that ate other creatures as a primary occupation. Apex predators with jaws that could crush bone, fast predators, ambush predators, pack hunters, venomous biters. Humans had not been at the top of this system when they started. They had been somewhere in the middle, smart enough to know they were in danger, slow enough that they couldn't outrun most of the things that were dangerous. And they had survived anyway, not by getting better teeth, not by getting faster, not by developing natural armor or toxins or any of the standard biological solutions to living in a dangerous environment. They had survived by getting more clever and more stubborn, and by cooperating with other humans in ways that compensated for their physical limitations, and by developing, and this was the part that the analysts had put in bold text, an almost unique capacity to identify how dangerous a situation was and then consciously decide to stay in it anyway. The analysts had a term for this: calculated risk tolerance. It meant humans could look at a bad situation, understand it was bad, agree out loud that it was bad, and then go into it on purpose because they had decided the potential gain was worth the potential harm. Other species had versions of this capacity. None of them had it to this degree. None of them had built their entire technological and social civilization on the back of it. Valdross turned pages. The military history section was where the disturbing parts started. He had seen the summary figures. Now he read the details. Human beings had been conducting organized warfare against other human beings for approximately 10,000 years. This was the documented record. The analysts suspected the actual number was higher. In those 10,000 years, they had fought with every material available to them: stone, wood, metal, chemical compounds, and eventually split atoms. They had fought on land, on water, underwater, in the air, and in the last 80 years, in space. In those 10,000 years, human beings had never collectively stopped. There had been periods of relative peace in various regions. There had never been a point at which every human society simultaneously stopped fighting something. The analysts noted this carefully. Humanity had been in a state of ongoing conflict somewhere on its planet for its entire recorded history, which meant that every human military tradition, every human tactical doctrine, every human warrior culture had been developed and refined and tested in actual combat for 10,000 consecutive years. The imperial military tradition was 412 years old. The analysts did not make this comparison explicitly. They didn't have to. The section on psychological warfare was particularly dense, and Valdross read it slowly. Humans had a concept they called psychological operations, deliberate manipulation of an enemy's mental state to achieve tactical advantage. They had studied this. They had doctrines for it. They had written books about it, going back thousands of years, and some of those books were still considered relevant by modern human military thinkers. One of the older texts, written by a human strategist roughly 2,500 years ago, had been translated in full and appended to the report. Valdross read parts of it. The human had written, "Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in danger." This was not remarkable advice. This was the kind of thing every species' military philosophers had said in various forms. What was remarkable was how long humans had been acting on it. They had thousands of years of documentation on what motivated enemies to fight, what made them afraid, what made them stupid, what made them stubborn, and what made them quit. They had thousands of years of evidence about which tactics worked on which psychological types. They had studied the emotional structure of conflict the way the Empire had studied weapons physics. The analyst flagged a particular human concept called morale. This was the measurement of a fighting force's willingness to continue fighting. Most species' militaries tracked something equivalent. Combat effectiveness declined as casualties rose and as the situation became more hopeless. Standard doctrine. You hit an enemy hard enough and their morale collapsed and they stopped. Human military history suggested this worked on humans too, usually. But human military history also suggested that under certain conditions, increasing pressure on human forces did not collapse their morale. It hardened it. The analysts had a name for this, borrowed from the humans themselves. The siege mentality. Humans who were outnumbered, outgunned, and under sustained attack did not reliably become more willing to surrender as the situation worsened. A significant portion of them became more angry, more determined, more creative, as if the pressure squeezed something useful out of them. There was a human phrase in the report that the translators had struggled with because the concept didn't map cleanly onto imperial thinking. The phrase was, backs against the wall. It described the state of being completely out of options, with nowhere to retreat. For most species, this was the point where you surrendered or died. For humans, the analysts had documented, the phrase carried a specific emotional connotation, something that could be rendered, approximately, as the point where things get serious. Veldros set the report down and looked at his wall for several minutes. Then he picked it up again and kept reading because he was a professional. The communications with Earth had continued during the 6 days since Proxima Station. They had been routine on the surface. The humans at Geneva had sent several follow-up messages about the surrender terms, continuing to negotiate as if they were in a contract dispute rather than an active military conflict with a fleet sitting in their outer system. They had asked questions about governance structures under imperial administration. They had flagged specific terms they found objectionable. One message had been written in a tone that Veldros could only describe as mildly irritated, as if they had been expecting a faster response to their counter-proposals. Prethvos had suggested ignoring the messages entirely. Show of dominance. Veldros had replied to all of them. Something in guts, some instinct that had kept him alive and winning for 38 years, told him that ignoring humans was probably a bad idea right now. The latest message from Geneva had arrived 2 hours ago. It was from someone named Deputy Director Chen, presumably not the medic Chen who had been right about the approach angle. And it was professional and direct and troubling. High Commander T. It read, "We are aware of the recent engagements at Proxima Station and the Kepler Ring. We want to be clear that we consider these acts of war, and that our full military authorization has been updated accordingly. We continue to prefer a negotiated resolution. We also want to be transparent with you. We have been reviewing your fleet's engagement data from both battles, and our military analysts have some observations we think would be useful to share with you before you proceed. We're not saying this to be threatening. We're saying it because the alternative is that you proceed without knowing, and we think that would be worse for everyone. If you want to talk, we're available. We're also available after 6 p.m. if that's easier. The time difference between your current position and Geneva is tricky. We understand the analysts had some observations. The alternative is that you proceed without knowing. We think that would be worse for everyone." The tone of it was bothering Veldros in a way he could not fully articulate. It was not the tone of a civilization being conquered. It was the tone of someone who could see a car crash coming and was genuinely trying to warn the driver. The mild worry in it was not for themselves. It was, and this felt insane to type into his personal log, for the Empire. He called Prethvos in and showed him the message. Prethvos read it twice. "They're bluffing," he said. "Psychological operation. They want us to hesitate." "What if they're not? Sir, we have 1,200 ships. We've lost 26 of them against minor outposts that weren't even their main defensive line. Against their actual fleet, their full military, which has been fighting wars for 10,000 years. Prethvos stopped. "Their full military," Veldros said quietly, "which has been in a constant state of active refinement for 10,000 years, which has developed doctrines for fighting forces larger than themselves, specifically because they spent millennia fighting each other, and the large forces usually won. What does it look like, Prith, when we engage that?" Prithvos didn't answer. "We took 9 ships at Proxima Station, 17 at Kepler Ring. The projections, the models that have never been more than 8% off in 63 prior engagements, are now telling us we will lose, at minimum, 300 ships taking Earth." Veldros let that number sit, 300, against the final defensive line of a species that got more dangerous at Kepler Ring when we increased the pressure. "The models could still be wrong," Prethvos said. He didn't sound like he believed it. "They are probably wrong," Veldros said. "The question is in which direction." There was a long silence on the bridge. Then Veldros said, "Reply to Deputy Director Chen. Tell her we'll speak after 6 p.m. Prethvos opened his mouth. "It's a conversation, Preth, not a surrender. We're not capitulating to a scheduling request. We're gathering intelligence." He turned back to the window. "Their analysts have observations. I want to hear them." The call happened at 1900 hours, measured by Geneva's time zone. Chen was a human woman in her 50s, with a face that was calm in the way that faces get calm after years of practice at it. She had two people beside her who were introduced as military advisors. One of them, a man named General Hammond, was eating something from a small container while the call started. He caught the translation relay's visual and set it down with the polished lack of embarrassment of a man who had done exactly this in many high-level meetings before. Commander Chen said, "Thank you for making the time." Deputy Director Vaildross said, "Your message suggested your analysts had observations. They do." She nodded at Hammond, who picked up a tablet, not his food, and looked at it. "We've analyzed your fleet's tactical patterns from both engagements. We want to be honest with you. Your ships are very good, your commanders are well trained, your doctrines are sophisticated. We're not being dismissive of any of that." Hammond leaned forward slightly. His voice was unhurried. "The problem is your doctrine is optimized for an enemy that wants to survive the engagement. Your ships are brilliant at creating situations where the rational move for the opponent is to retreat or surrender. You use superior numbers to close off options. It works. It's been working for 400 years against, and I mean this respectfully, species that respond rationally to being outmatched." He paused. "We don't," he said. Chen picked up from there. "When you took Proxima Station and the Kepler Ring, our people did not experience those as defeats. They experienced them as evidence that the tactics we have been developing for the last 40 years, specifically in anticipation of a conflict with a superior galactic force, are working. We lost those positions. We did not lose our assessment of the situation." She folded her hands on the table. "High Commander, I want to ask you a direct question. In 63 prior engagements, how often have you fought an enemy that was genuinely not afraid of you?" Vaildross said nothing. "Our people," Chen said, "are afraid. I want to be honest about that. But we have a long history of doing the things we're afraid of anyway. That history is relevant to any projection you're running about the Earth engagement." She paused. "And we haven't used our full assets yet." "What assets?" Hammond smiled. It was a small, tired smile, not threatening, which somehow made it more unsettling. "The ones we built because we've known for about 40 years that something like you was probably out there. We didn't know when. We've been getting ready anyway." He picked up his food container again, considered it, put it back down. "We'd like to not use them. That's the honest truth. Using them will be bad for everyone, including us. Possibly especially us." He shrugged. "That's not really the point for us, though. I want you to understand that. The outcome for us is not the primary calculation. We've been at this long enough that we know what we're willing to do." The call ended 20 minutes later without any resolutions. Terms were discussed and not agreed upon. Lines were drawn that both sides knew were not final. But Vaildross sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of his quarters, looking at the report, thinking about Hammond's smile, the small, tired one, the one that said, "This is unfortunate, and we're going to do it anyway." He thought about the garrison soldier asking for peanut butter. He thought about the frigate pilot playing music while the ship burned around him. He thought about 10,000 years. Then he opened a new channel to the Imperial Strategic Command and requested an urgent briefing, not to report progress, to request something he had never requested in 38 years of command: reinforcements, and more xenological analysts. He had a feeling he was going to need both. The Imperial Strategic Command sent 2,000 additional ships. They also sent Admiral Threnkas. Threnkas was the most celebrated military mind in the Empire, not the most aggressive. That honor belonged to a fleet admiral who had died in the Drenathi campaign and had a sector named after him. Not the most decorated. That was a title spread across several officers who had served longer than Threnkas. But the most celebrated, because Threnkas was the one who had cracked the Sorin Confederacy in 91 days, which stood as the fastest absorption of a multi-system power in Imperial history. She had done it not through brute force but through a campaign so surgically precise that the Sorin political structure had collapsed from the inside before their military fully understood it was happening. She arrived on the absolute dominion 3 days after the request for reinforcements went through. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with the pale gray-blue coloring of high-caste Reach lineage, and eyes that had the unsettling quality of appearing to calculate something whenever they were pointed at you. She shook Vaildross's hand, accepted a briefing from Preth Voss, and then sat in the command chair for 4 hours reading every piece of intelligence they had on humanity, without saying a single word. At the end of the 4 hours, she said, "You've been too gentle." Vaildross looked at her. "I've lost 26 ships against minor outposts. You've been engaging them at colony positions with forces small enough that each engagement feels winnable to their garrisons. Small enough that their people can look at the results and say, 'We made them bleed.'" She set the tablet down. "That's morale. You've been feeding their morale. Every ship we lose at a human outpost is a story they tell each other. A proof point. Right now they believe they can hurt us. We need to eliminate that belief before we go for Earth. And how do we eliminate it? Threnkas's expression didn't change. We stopped going in small enough to bleed. The plan she built over the next 48 hours was, Vaildros had to admit, technically elegant. She identified the 3 largest human military installations outside Earth's orbit: a shipyard facility in an asteroid belt called the Foundry, a deep space command station called Watchtower, and the human fleet's primary reserve staging area, which the humans had named Bulwark with a confidence that struck Threnkas as premature. She proposed hitting all 3 simultaneously with overwhelming force. Not 50 ships against 12, 800 ships against each target, simultaneously, so that no installation could call for help from the others, and so that no victory the humans achieved at any one location could be contextualized as anything except the loss of the other 2. Eliminate the morale, eliminate the story, then Earth. Vaildros approved the plan. He had concerns he could not fully articulate, which was unusual for him. But Threnkas had cracked the Sorin, and Threnkas was probably right. The objection he could not quite form sat in his gut like a stone, and he overrode it, because gut feelings were not strategic doctrine. 3 fleets moved out simultaneously. Vaildros commanded the force bound for the Foundry. Threnkas took Watchtower personally. A senior fleet admiral named Brenthal took Bulwark. What happened at the Foundry took 11 hours. It took 11 hours because the Foundry was, as the intelligence had suggested, a shipyard. And shipyards were full of tools and materials and people who knew how to build things, and it emerged how to make those things lethal on extremely short notice. The Foundry's workers had no formal military training. They were welders, engineers, fabricators, and the people who scheduled shifts and ordered parts. What they had was 800 ships of Imperial fleet bearing down on them, and 3 days of warning from the moment Vaildros's reinforcements arrived to the moment the fleets launched. 3 days during which the Foundry workers had apparently sat down and thought very hard about what they were going to do with what they had. What they had, it turned out, was 3 partially completed warships in dry dock, several thousand tons of structural metal, a truly remarkable quantity of mining explosives used for asteroid processing, and the kind of ingenuity that seemed to function in humans, roughly the way panic functioned in other species, as a fuel rather than a brake. The 3 dry dock ships were not spaceworthy. They had no complete engines. 2 of them had no weapons systems installed yet. The workers launched them anyway, on partial thrusters, directly at the Imperial fleet's approach vector, packed full of mining explosives on a timed detonation sequence. This was not a sophisticated tactic. It was almost insultingly simple. The Imperial fleet destroyed all 3 ships well before they reached detonation range and adjusted approach vectors as standard procedure. The adjustment put the fleet's left flank over a debris field that the Foundry workers had seeded in the previous 72 hours, piece by piece, in small amounts, using cargo drones running their normal routes, which the Imperial surveillance drones had logged as routine supply movement and had not flagged. The debris field was not weapons, it was not mines, it was structural metal, cut to specific sizes and seeded at specific densities in specific positions, so that when the fleet's engines burned through the field, the metal was pulled into the intake manifolds of 17 ships almost simultaneously, and those ships either stopped or went wildly off course, depending on which manifolds were hit. A debris field, metal trash. And then the actual human warships, which had been running quiet behind the Foundry's sensor shadow on a completely different approach vector, hit the 17 compromised Imperial ships from behind, while the rest of the fleet was dealing with the recalibration. By the time it was over, the Foundry was taken. Vaildros had the numbers. He had lost 61 ships. 61. He forwarded the number to Threnkas without commentary, because there was nothing useful to say. He received her after-action numbers 2 hours later. Watchtower had been heavily fortified, more than the intelligence had suggested. The humans had apparently spent the last several days moving assets there. She had taken it after 6 hours, but the cost was 44 ships, and the station's data core had been wiped so cleanly that the Empire's forensic teams estimated it would take months to recover anything useful. Brenthal's numbers from Bulwark were the ones that made Vaildros stand very still. Brenthal had not taken Bulwark. The staging area had been empty. Every ship that was supposed to be there had been moved, and in their place the Empire's ground teams found a single functioning communications terminal, a small table, and on the table, in a sealed container presumably to keep it fresh, 2 sandwiches, and a handwritten note. The note had been translated 3 times to make sure the translation was correct. It read, "These are for you. The one on the left has mustard, the one on the right doesn't. We figured you'd be hungry. Sorry we couldn't stick around. We figured you were coming to this one specifically, and frankly Bulwark wasn't worth the ships. Come talk to us when you're ready. We'll be at Earth, General Hammond, Unified Human Defense Forces, PS. The mustard one is better. Trust us. Thren Kas was on the Absolute Dominion bridge when Vaildross showed her the report. She read it once. She read it again. She set it down, walked to the observation window, and looked at the stars for 2 full minutes. Vaildross did not interrupt her. They knew, she said finally. They knew we were planning to hit all 3 simultaneously. Yes, they let us take 2 of them, on purpose, because those 2 were worth the cost. The Foundry cost us 61 ships and gave them nothing except damaged ships we'll spend resources repairing. And Watchtower was a trap, and they stripped it of everything useful before we got there. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose in a gesture that Vaildross recognized with a start because he had done the same thing when he'd first received the Proxima Station report, and Bulwark was there to show us they knew. And to feed the soldiers, Vaildross said. And to feed the soldiers. She turned around. Her expression had changed in a way he had not seen on her face before. The calculation in her eyes was still there, but there was something else alongside it now. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent. The look of someone who had run a model and had not liked the output. Vale, what do they have at Earth? We don't have firm intelligence on the full composition. Our surveillance drones at that range have been neutralized or spoofed regularly. What we know for certain, what do they have? He brought up the projection on the main display. It was by necessity incomplete. What they could confirm. A significant portion of the total human fleet, which had grown over the past week as reserve ships they had not previously detected came online at various positions. The fleet's new projected size was, and the analysts had flagged their confidence level as low, which in itself was telling, somewhere between 400 and 600 warships. The Empire had still over 2,500 ships available. The numbers were fine. The numbers had been fine the whole time. The fleet isn't what worries me, Thren Kas said. She was reading the full assessment now. The intelligence picture assembled over the past 2 weeks. It's the 40 years. The 40 years. Deputy Director Chen told you they had been preparing for 40 years. Hammond confirmed it on the call. They said they had assets we haven't seen. She pulled up the cultural historical section on the display and read a passage out loud. Her voice was flat, clinical, a navigator calling out coordinates. Human history contains numerous documented examples of technologically inferior forces defeating superior forces through unconventional application of available resources, psychological exploitation of enemy doctrine, and this as I keep returning to, creative use of the enemy's own assumptions against them. She set the tablet down. We have assumptions, she said. We've had them the whole time. They've been watching how we fight for 2 weeks. They know our doctrine. They know our approach vectors, our formation preferences, our response patterns to irregular tactics. They have 40 years of preparation for this exact type of conflict, and we have walked in using our standard playbook. And they have spent 2 weeks reading every page of it. The bridge was very quiet. One of the junior tactical officers, the young one, Dry Voss, looked like he had something to say but was not sure he should say it. Vaildross looked at him. Speak, Dry Voss said carefully. Sir, the sandwiches, yes. They sent sandwiches. To the enemy fleet, who was coming to destroy them. That's not a military gesture. That's not intimidation and it's not really humor. It's almost hospitable, Thren Kas said. Yes, it's hospitable. Which means, I don't know exactly what it means, but they're comfortable. They're comfortable with this. They're not panicking. They're ready, said Vaildross. The word sat there. Outside, the stars did not move. The fleet sat in position, 2,500 ships, more firepower than any force humanity had ever faced. On paper, the numbers were not complicated. The numbers had never been complicated. Vaildross thought about the xenological report. He thought about backs against the wall. He thought about how the phrase didn't mean what it should mean for humans. He thought about 10,000 years of practice. He thought about the garrison soldier asking for peanut butter. He thought about the fact that the humans had known they were coming to Bulwark, had pulled every ship and asset out cleanly, and had still taken the time to leave sandwiches. That last detail was bothering him more than any tactical calculation. It was the most human thing that had happened in 2 weeks, and he was starting to understand that the most human things were the most important data points. You could model a fleet action. You could model force composition and weapons ranges and reaction times. You could not. He was now fairly certain. Build an accurate model for a species that reacted to existential threat by making sure the people threatening them had enough to eat. He could not model comfortable. He looked at Thren Kas. She was still looking at the display. Her expression was the one he recognized now. The model that had produced an output she didn't like. "We're going to Earth," he said. "Yes," she said. "And we're going in with everything." "Yes." He straightened his uniform. He thought about 63 prior engagements. He thought about the sector named after the admiral who had died killing the Drenathi. He thought about 412 years of a record that had never been broken. "Get every analyst we have working on their doctrine," he said. "I want fresh models that account for irrational behavior at every engagement level. I want contingencies for tactics we cannot currently predict. I want every assumption our fleet operates on examined and flagged." He turned to Prethvos. "And I want someone to tell me what mustard is." Prethvos blinked. "Sir, the note said the mustard one is better. I want to understand why they said that. What it means about them. Why they mentioned it." He walked toward his command chair. "Every detail is data, every single one." He sat down. The fleet waited. The blue planet was 1 light year away now. In his private log that night, Vale-Dross wrote a single line. "I have fought 63 civilizations, and not one of them has made me feel like the one who should be worried." Then he thought for a moment. Then he wrote, "I think I have been the human fleet was waiting for them, not at Earth, not at the moon, not at any of the orbital defense stations that the Imperial intelligence maps had flagged. The human fleet was waiting for them at the outer edge of the system, sitting in open space. And when the 2,500 ship Imperial Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the humans were already there, and arranged in a formation that the Imperial tactical AI spent approximately 4 seconds analyzing before producing a report that could be summarized, in plain language, as, 'We have not seen this before. It was not a defensive formation. It was not an offensive formation. It was something the AI classified under a category that technically existed in Imperial tactical doctrine, but that had never been encountered in actual practice. A formation designed to look like a formation, while the actual tactical intent was concealed somewhere that required you to already understand the enemy's thinking to decode. The AI called it an ambiguity array, which was a technical term meaning, 'We know they're doing something. We don't know what." High Commander Vale-Dross looked at it from the observation bridge of the Absolute Dominion and thought about the sandwiches. Beside him, Admiral Threnkas was quiet. She had been quiet for most of the transit. She had spent the final approach running models, all of them. New ones, old ones, adapted ones that tried to factor in what 2 weeks of studying human behavior had taught them. The models kept diverging at the point where human response to extreme pressure was supposed to produce predictable behavior, because the predictable behavior wasn't there. Every model hit that point and splintered into a range of outcomes so wide that the confidence intervals were effectively useless. She had eventually closed the models and read historical accounts of human battles instead. She had read about a human engagement called Thermopylae, where 300 soldiers held a narrow pass against an army of hundreds of thousands for 3 days, and achieved, by the time it was over, something that was not a military victory, but that human historians still wrote about 2,500 years later as if it was. She had read about a siege at a place called Stalingrad, where 2 armies ground each other down in a ruined city for 5 months of winter, until the numbers stopped making sense. She had read about a small island nation that had stood alone against the largest military power on their planet for a year, while the rest of the world waited to see if they'd fold. And that had not folded. All of these stories had one thing in common. In none of them were the humans the ones with more ships. She had closed the history files and come to stand beside Vale-Dross, and had not said anything since. The human fleet held position. The Imperial fleet held position. Nothing happened for 6 minutes, which was already unusual. 6 minutes of 2 fleets looking at each other across empty space. Then the communication channel opened. It was General Hammond's voice. Vale-Dross recognized it immediately. It still had that quality. Unhurried, slightly tired, like a man who had been up since early and was on his 3rd drink of something warm and was not inclined to perform urgency for anyone. "Hi, Commander," Hammond said. "Good to finally talk to you directly. I'd say welcome to the neighborhood. But I guess you've been in the neighborhood for a few weeks now, so welcome back." Vale-Dross looked at Threnkas. Threnkas was looking at the display, not at him. "General," Vale-Dross said, "you've been waiting for us. We have. You folks took a bit longer than we expected after Bulwark. Hope the sandwiches were okay, by the way. The mustard was imported. We tried to do right by you. You knew we'd bring everything. We hoped you would, yeah." A pause. "It's actually better for us if you bring everything. Means you're taking us seriously. A half measure would have been messier for both of us." Another pause. "Can I ask you something before we get into it?" Vale-Dross considered this. "Yes. The xenological report your team wrote, the 400-page one. I'm assuming you wrote one. Did they tell you about Spite?" Vale-Dross was quiet for a moment. "They did. The translators had difficulty with the concept. Yeah, it doesn't translate great. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. Hammond's voice shifted slightly. Not more aggressive, more honest. Here's the thing about us that I think is hard to communicate through an intelligence report. We're not fighting you because we think we can definitely win. Some of us think we can. Some of us aren't sure. Some of us think we probably can't and have decided to fight anyway. All three groups are out here, High Commander, and they are all equally committed to this, and that is the part that your models are going to keep getting wrong. Because your models are built on the assumption that the group that thinks they can't win will eventually separate themselves from the groups that think they can. They won't, they never have. He stopped, then he said more quietly, "We'd really prefer not to fight you. We want you to know that. It's not weakness to say that. We're allowed to prefer peace and still be completely ready to not have it. Those two things aren't contradictions for us." Vaildross looked at the formation on the tactical display, the ambiguity array that the AI couldn't decode. 400 to 600 warships, arranged in a pattern that concealed something. He thought about backs against the wall. He thought about Dryvoss's word. Comfortable, he thought about 40 years of preparation. "What have you built?" he said. "In those 40 years. Hammond took a breath that was clearly audible over the channel. "You want the list?" "Yes." "Okay." A sound that might have been the scrape of a chair. The short version. We've spent 40 years working on the assumption that someone would show up with more ships and better technology than us, because we've been watching the galaxy long enough to know that's statistically likely, and because we've spent 10,000 years fighting each other, which means we have a very good understanding of what it looks like when you're outmatched, and what you can still do about it. He started listing things. He listed them in a flat voice without editorializing, the way you'd read a supply inventory. And as he went through the list, Vaildross felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt in 38 years of command and could not immediately name. He felt it again when Threnkas, beside him, put one hand very slowly on the railing in front of her and held it there. The things on the list were not, individually, impossible to defeat. The Empire had faced analogs to most of them. But the human approach was not to build one overwhelming counter-weapon. It was to build layers. Each layer was designed to force an adaptation. And by the time the adaptation was complete, the next layer was waiting. Not a wall. A maze purpose-built for an enemy with more ships and more firepower, and a doctrine based on the assumption that size and technology would eventually break any resistance. A maze designed by people who had been inside that maze, on both sides for thousands of years. And the last item on the list, Hammond said, which is the one I think you should probably weigh most heavily, is this. We have 22,000 soldiers, sailors, and support personnel currently deployed in this engagement. And every single one of them volunteered to be here. Not conscripted, not ordered, they chose this. His voice was still level, but it had weight in it now. I have letters from some of them that they gave me before we deployed. For their families, in case. And I have read every one of those letters. And High Commander, I want to be very honest with you about this. None of them say what you'd expect. None of them are tragic. Most of them are funny, actually. Most of them say some version of, "I'm fine, don't worry. I know what I'm doing," because they do know what they're doing. These people have been training for this for years. Some of them have been training their whole careers for this specific situation. And they walked out here anyway. He paused. Comfortable, he said. That's the word, I think. We're not happy about it. We're not fearless. We're just comfortable with what we decided. And I need you to understand that that is not going to change based on how many ships you brought. The bridge of the Absolute Dominion was very quiet. Vaildross looked at his display. He looked at 2,500 ships. He looked at the human formation. He looked at the ambiguity array that his AI couldn't decode and thought about the layers Hammond had listed and thought about the fact that the human fleet was a fraction of the Imperial force and they were sitting out here in the open, waiting, comfortable. He thought about a specific number, 142. That was the combined total of Imperial ships lost in the 2 prior campaigns before this moment. 142 ships from skirmishes at outposts, from a debris field made of scrap metal, from a trap at a command station, from 22,000 volunteers who were comfortable. The updated projection for a full Earth engagement against the actual human home fleet using the tactics Hammond had just described had a confidence interval so wide it was almost meaningless. The low end said 400 ships. The high end said the Empire would win, but the word win would require redefining. Threnkas spoke for the first time in 40 minutes. She spoke quietly enough that only Vaildross could hear. In 63 engagements, she said, we have never had to redefine what winning means. No, Vaildross said. What is it worth, she said, absorbing them. What is it worth? He didn't answer, because it was not a tactical question. He opened the channel again. "General Hammond," he said. "Still here, High Commander. You mentioned you'd prefer not to fight." "I did. I meant it. What would a negotiated resolution look like, from your side?" There was a pause, not a long one. "Can I be honest with you? Please. We're not going to accept absorption. That's off the table. We're not going to be administered by the Empire under Imperial governance. We've read enough about how that works, and it's not for us." His voice was even. "What we're open to is a relationship. Trade access, technology exchange, mutual non-aggression. The kind of arrangement where the Empire gets the benefit of dealing with us without the cost of conquering us, and we get to remain ourselves. Which is, I think, actually a better deal for you than the alternative. And if we disagree, then we're going to be here for a long time," Hammond said simply. "And I mean that in the most literal possible sense. We are going to be here for as long as this takes. We're not going anywhere. This is our home." Valdros closed his eyes. He thought about 412 years. He thought about 63 civilizations. He thought about the sector named after the admiral. He thought about what Threncase had said. "What is it worth?" He thought about the analyst's note. "Recommend escalating xenological study." He thought about the fact that in the 63 prior engagements, not one of the absorbed species had ever, years later, been an asset in the way Hammond was implying. They paid taxes, they provided labor, they occupied garrison troops and required administration. They had never sat across a table and offered something the Empire couldn't already take. Humanity was, he realized, offering something the Empire had never been offered before. Not because the others hadn't wanted to. Because the others had not been in a position to make an offer from anything other than desperation. These people were not desperate. These people were sitting at the edge of their home system. Comfortable. Waiting. With 40 years of preparation behind them and 22,000 volunteers and letters written to families that were mostly funny, and they were offering to negotiate. Not begging, not surrendering, offering. He opened his eyes. "General," he said, "I'd like to propose a temporary suspension of hostilities while we explore the terms of a potential arrangement." A pause on the other end. "Yeah," Hammond said, and there was something in his voice that sounded, incredibly, like relief. Not the relief of someone who had been afraid, but the relief of someone who had been prepared to do something very hard, and was genuinely glad they might not have to. "Yeah, I think we can work with that. I'll need to consult with Imperial Command before any formal agreement. Of course. Take whatever time you need." A pause. "High Commander," Hammond said. "General, we should do this properly. Face to face. Our people, your people at table, something to eat, if you're open to it. A beat. We can come to your ship if that's easier. We don't want to make this uncomfortable for you." Valdros looked at Threncase. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile, and was not quite relief, and was something that would take both of them a while to put a name to. "We'll come to Earth," Valdros said. "Good. I'll have someone set up a room." A pause. "Allergies? Dietary restrictions? I know it sounds like a strange question under the circumstances. But we're going to feed you. That's not optional. It's what we do." It was Prethvos, standing behind his commander, who said it. He said it quietly, almost to himself, not meaning for anyone to hear. But the channel was still open, and the translation AI caught it and transmitted it. He said, "They're going to feed us." And Hammond on the other end laughed, a real laugh. The kind that comes out when something is genuinely funny and you're too tired to keep the professional face in place. "Yeah," he said, "we are. It's going to be fine, probably. Come on over." The first human-imperial negotiations took place 4 days later, in a building in Geneva with tall windows that let in too much light, around a long table set with more food than the imperial delegation knew what to do with. General Hammond ate throughout. Deputy Director Chen was efficient and sharp and twice caught an imperial legal advisor trying to insert language into a proposed clause that would have created an administrative loophole she then removed with the precision of a surgeon. Threncase, observing from the side of the room, spent most of the first day watching the humans, not the negotiators, the staff, the support people who came in and out with documents and water and on 2 occasions more food. She watched how they moved, around each other. The quick jokes exchanged under the table's official atmosphere, the small familiar touches, a hand on a shoulder, a nod across the room, of people who had come through something together and knew it. Comfortable. On the second day, she sat down and started negotiating directly. Because Threncase had cracked the Soren Confederacy and had not done it by watching from the side of the room, and because she had decided that whatever outcome came from these negotiations, it was going to be an outcome she had shaped. On the third day, during a break, Hammond sat beside Valdros on a bench outside the building, where the autumn air was cold and clear, and they sat in not quite comfortable, but not hostile silence for a while, and Hammond had a cup of something hot that smelled like burnt plants, and he offered some to Vaildros. And Vaildros, who had not survived 38 years in Imperial service without a talent for reading situations, accepted. It was terrible. Coffee, Hammond said, watching his face acquire taste. It is very strong. Yeah. We've been drinking it for centuries. You get used to it. He looked at the sky. You were really going to come in with everything. Yes. Would have been ugly. Yes, Vaildros said. It would have. Hammond was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you made the right call today. The other option was survivable, probably on both ends. But this is better. Probably, Vaildros said, and Hammond laughed again, and Vaildros found, with a small surprise, that the sound was not unpleasant. The agreement that came out of the 3-day negotiation was a mutual recognition accord. Not absorption, not alliance, but something between them that had not exactly existed before in Imperial diplomatic vocabulary and that both sides agreed would need to be developed further over time, which both sides privately understood was a polite way of saying, this is the beginning, not the end. Trade rights, a joint communications protocol, an agreement that neither party would fire the first shot going forward, without a period of mandatory negotiation, the length of which the humans had negotiated from 48 hours to a full week, because, Hammond had said this plainly and without embarrassment, a week gives people time to eat and sleep and think, and better decisions come out of that. The Empire's formal record of the engagement would note, in official documentation, first contact engagement with species designated H40-1 self-designated human Earth Eurasian, species declined absorption, mutual recognition accord established, assessment, significant military capacity, non-standard tactical doctrine, strong territorial sovereignty orientation, recommend extended diplomatic engagement. In a personal note appended to his official after-action report, Vaildros wrote something that would be quoted at the Imperial War College for the next 100 years. Though not in the section they originally intended it for. He wrote, in 63 prior engagements, the question I have asked before any military action is, will they fight? In this engagement, for the first time, I found I had to ask a different question. The question was, when they fight, where does it end? With 63 prior civilizations, the answer was always, at the point when survival was no longer viable. With humanity, I could not find that point, not because they have no limit, but because the limit, whatever it is, lies further than I could calculate, further than my models could project, and further, I believe, than they themselves know. And they know this about themselves. They carry that knowledge comfortably. The way you carry something you've had long enough, that you've stopped noticing the weight. We did not lose this engagement, but I am not certain we won it either. What I am certain of is this. We are fortunate that we are having lunch with them rather than the alternative. The coffee is not good. I am told it is acquired. I will try it again. On a bench outside the negotiating room, General Hammond looked at the pale autumn sky above Geneva and thought about the letters from his soldiers, the ones he'd read before deployment, the mostly funny ones. He thought about the 2,200 miles of ocean at the edge of the world, and the 400-year empire on the other side of the sky, and the morning, 3 weeks ago, when they'd gotten the news that 1,200 ships had dropped into their outer system, and a very polite imperial bureaucrat had asked them to please consider surrender. He thought about the lunch that was already scheduled. He thought about how they'd called the Empire back and asked them to wait until 2:30. He thought about how it had been the right call. He looked at his coffee. He drank it. He was already thinking about the next negotiation session, because Hammond was the kind of man who was always already thinking about the next thing. Not because he was anxious, but because thinking about the next thing was the job, and he was good at the job. And good at the job had gotten them here, at a table with a 400-year empire, with food and coffee in the autumn air, and a piece of paper that said they got to stay themselves. Not a bad Tuesday, he thought, not bad at all.